When they broke down the wall of his house, the neighbors thought they were rescuing a man, but in truth, they were witnessing a miracle wrapped in tragedy. A man who once dreamed of being invisible became a global spectacle. This is not just the story of the world's heaviest man. It's the story of a boy who only wanted to be loved and the weight that love never gave him. His name was John Brower Minnock, and before the world saw his body, the world had already broken his soul. The house on Willow Street was small, old, and smelled faintly of bread and damp earth. It stood on the edge of Bainbridge Island, a quiet town washed in the constant breath of the Pacific. Inside, a boy sat on the floor, tracing circles on the faded linoleum with his finger. His name was John Brower Minnock, and from the moment he arrived in this world in 1941, everything about him seemed just a little too large for the space he was given. When John was born, the nurses had whispered. In surprise, he weighed 8 pounds at birth, not unusual, but by his first birthday he had doubled the number twice over. Big boy, the doctor said cheerfully, tapping the baby's thigh with the back of his pen. His mother, Mildred, smiled politely. She was proud, yes, but also uneasy. Mother, no, things doctors don't. By the time John turned 5, his shirts needed to be specially sewn. The other children in the neighborhood called him Big Johnny, not cruelly at first, just with the innocent curiosity of children who noticed everything. But innocence fades quickly, and curiosity often curdles into cruelty. At school, the whispers began. He broke the chair again. He eats 2 lunches. He's like a bear. Every laugh stabbed at something inside him he didn't yet have words for. The teachers tried to hush the teasing, but pity never healed ridicule. John learned early that silence could be armor. He didn't fight back, he just smiled, turned his eyes downward, and went on pretending he didn't hear. John's parents loved him fiercely but differently. His father, Herbert, was a fisherman who worked the docks, his skin cracked and salted from years of storms. He rarely spoke more than a sentence at a time, but when he looked at his son, there was both love and confusion in his eyes, like a man staring at a map he couldn't read. Mildred, on the other hand, fought with quiet hope. She packed John's lunches with fruit and salads, cut out sugar, tried home, made remedies she'd read about in old magazines. Nothing worked. The weight came as naturally as breathing. One evening, after John had outgrown yet another set of clothes, Mildred sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. Herbert came in from the rain, his boots leaving dark prints on the floor. "He's a good boy," Herbert said softly. "I know," she replied. "But what happens when the world stops seeing that?" John stood just outside the doorway, listening. He didn't mean to, but the words sank into him, deep and heavy. Even at 8 years old, he understood what it meant to worry about him. That night, he promised himself he'd make his mother smile again. He helped her in the kitchen, fetched wood for the fire, and made silly faces until she laughed through her tears. In that laughter, John found something that food never gave him, peace. But peace never lasted long. By the time John turned 12, he weighed over 200 pounds. He still had that bright, gentle face, but his body grew faster than his spirit could keep up. Running became painful. Sitting on the floor made it hard to stand up again. Gym class was torture. The teacher, trying to be kind, excused him from the rope climb, but that only made the stairs worse. "Let's give John a chance," someone would say, and when he tried, when he really, truly tried, the laughter would echo across the walls as he slipped, breathless, red-faced, desperate to belong. At lunch, he sat alone more often than not. Sometimes he'd pretend to read while eating, to look busy enough that no one would notice. But kids notice everything. After school, he would walk home along the shore where the sea stretched endlessly and didn't care what he looked like. The wind never judged. The water didn't whisper. He loved the sound of waves colliding with rock. It was messy, unpredictable, and somehow free. He used to imagine himself diving in, swimming so far out that no one could ever find him again. But he couldn't swim. His body was too heavy to float. That irony stayed with him, sharp as glass. When John turned 15, Mildred took him to a specialist in Seattle. It was a long, quiet drive across the ferry. She'd borrowed a coat from a neighbor because John's no longer fit him. The doctor, a tall man with silver hair, examined him carefully, lifting his arm, checking his pulse, his heart, his breathing. He scribbled notes on a clipboard, lips pressed tight. "He's healthy," the doctor said finally, "but his body's retaining more Wait, then we can explain, possibly a metabolic condition, or maybe something genetic. There's no real cure. Only management. Mildred nodded, her eyes glassy. John stared at the floor. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood enough. Something inside him was broken, something no diet or exercise could fix. The ride home was silent, except for the hum of tires on wet asphalt. When they got back, John went straight to his room and shut the door. He didn't cry. He just sat there, staring at his hands, those same hands that used to fit inside his mother's palm. Outside, the rain fell harder. It was the summer of 1958, when Bainbridge hosted its annual fair. John, now 17, had grown into a man's body, nearly 400 pounds of him. He didn't want to go, but his mother insisted. "You need to be out there," she said. "You need to live, Johnny." So he went. At the fair, the smell of popcorn and fried dough filled the air. Children ran past him, laughing, ribbons in their hair. He felt like a shadow moving through sunlight, present but unseen. Then he saw her, a girl about his age, with auburn hair and green eyes, standing near the carousel. She smiled at him. Not a mocking smile, not pity either, just warmth. Her name was Jeanette. They talked for hours about music, about books, about nothing important at all. She didn't mention his size once. For the first time in years, John forgot his body existed. When the lights of the fair flickered on and the music began to fade, she said softly, "You have kind eyes, John. Don't ever hide them." He walked home that night lighter than he'd felt in years. His body hadn't changed, but his heart had. After high school, John tried to find work. He took small jobs around the docks, fixing ropes, cleaning nets, helping his father when he could. But his size made everything harder. Employers turned him away gently, their words polite but their eyes full of discomfort. He began spending more time indoors. The radio became his world. He'd listen to jazz, the deep voices of late-night hosts, the news about a world that felt like it existed on another planet. He dreamed of traveling, of seeing places where nobody knew his name or his story, but dreams are fragile when trapped inside walls. At 22, John weighed over 600 pounds. He could still move, but slowly. Each step took thought, each breath carried effort, yet through it all, he remained kind. Neighbors would knock when they needed help fixing something. John would always try. Even if it meant sitting in the grass, hammer in hand, sweat running down his face, he'd do it, smiling the whole time. One neighbor once told him, "You're too good for this world, John." He laughed. "Maybe that's why it keeps trying to push me out." Years later, at a community gathering, he met Jeanette again, the same girl from the summer fair. Time had passed, but her smile hadn't changed. She remembered him immediately. "You still have kind eyes," she said. They began seeing each other often, coffee at her place, walks in the evenings when the air was cool enough for him to breathe comfortably. She never asked about his weight. She never told him to change. She just talked, listened, and existed beside him like it was the most natural thing in the world. For the first time, John felt seen. They married in 1963 in a quiet ceremony behind his parents' house. It wasn't grand, but it was full of love. In the wedding photos, Jeanette's head barely reached his shoulder. He stood tall, smiling wide, eyes glistening with something between joy and disbelief. He often said later that marrying Jeanette would be the one miracle he ever received. But life, even kind life, has a way of testing miracles. Marriage brought happiness, but it also brought reality. John's health continued to deteriorate. He could no longer tie his shoes or climb stairs without gasping. Jeanette helped him bathe, helped him dress, cooked meals that followed the doctor's strict diets, but nothing worked. His metabolism seemed to rebel against every effort. At night, she'd hear him struggle to breathe in his sleep. She'd place her hand on his chest just to feel it rise and fall. Each movement was a fight. Still, he tried to keep his humor. When she worried, he'd joke, "You didn't marry me for my running speed, did you?" She'd roll her eyes and kiss his cheek, but inside, she was terrified. By the mid-1970s, John's weight had reached 900 pounds. The floorboards in their home creaked under his steps. They reinforced the bed with steel brackets. Visitors came less often. The world outside moved on without him. But Jeanette stayed, always. It was June 10th, 1978, a humid summer night. John had been restless all evening, his breathing shallow. Around midnight, Jeanette woke to the sound of him gasping. His face had gone pale, his chest heaved violently. She called for help. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but when they saw him, they hesitated. John's body filled the small room. The doorway was too narrow. They couldn't move him. They called the fire department. Neighbors gathered outside as lights flashed red and blue across the street. Within an hour, a crew of men began tearing down the side of the house. The walls splintered, dust filled the air, and as they finally lifted John out, using a stretcher reinforced with wood and rope, the cameras appeared, flashes, reporters, headlines, the world's heaviest man. Human mountain rescued. John's eyes, half closed, caught the glint of lenses. He wasn't ashamed for himself. He was ashamed for his wife, for his parents, for the quiet life that had now become a spectacle. As they carried him out, Jeanette walked beside the stretcher, holding his hand tightly. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're going to be okay." He looked at her, tears welling. "They're not saving me," he said softly. "They're showing me to the world." The ambulance took him to the University Hospital of Seattle. It was past midnight when they finally wheeled him into a room reinforced with steel bars to support his weight. Doctors surrounded him, murmuring, measuring, adjusting machines. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the fluorescent lights blurring into long white streaks. He remembered the last thing Jeanette said before they took him through the hospital doors. "I'll be right here when you wake up." And she was, every day, every hour. Lying there, unable to move, John thought back to his childhood. The smell of the ocean, the sound of rain on his bedroom window, his mother's hands kneading bread. He remembered being the boy who wanted to make everyone smile, who believed kindness could outweigh cruelty. And he realized something. All his life he had been running from the weight, fighting it, hiding from it, wishing it away. But it wasn't the pounds that crushed him most. It was the loneliness, the feeling that no matter how much love he gave, the world would only ever see his size. That night, in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, John whispered to the nurse checking his vitals, "Do you think people ever really see what's inside a person?" She looked at him, puzzled, and said, "Sometimes, when they stop looking at everything else." He smiled weakly. Then maybe that's enough. The world outside the hospital would soon know his name, his weight, his record, but none of them would know the story. The boy who hid behind the weight, who dreamed of swimming in the sea, who loved more deeply than most could ever imagine. Inside those walls, John Brower Minnock was not the heaviest man alive. He was just a man, trying to breathe, and this was only the beginning. For days, the hospital room became John Brower Minnock's entire world, four walls of white, an ocean of tubes and machines, and the low hum of fluorescent lights that never truly dimmed. Nurses came and went in quiet rhythm, their footsteps soft, their eyes kind but cautious. John could barely turn his head without help. The simplest movement sent waves of exhaustion through him. His chest felt like it carried a boulder. His heart raced from effort. Most people never noticed breathing, blinking, existing. But in the chaos of beeping monitors and whispered voices, there was one constant: Jeanette. Every morning, she came in carrying a small bouquet, sometimes daisies, sometimes lavender. She'd place it on the windowsill, next to a photograph of them from years before. Then she'd sit, brush the hair from his forehead, and whisper, "Good morning, love." Those words, small as they were, had the power to pull him through the day. John's body had reached a weight few could comprehend. The hospital's scales estimated nearly 1,400 pounds, his body swollen with fluid, skin stretched taut and pale. Doctors and nurses handled him with precision, lifting him with slings designed for industrial equipment, turning him every few hours to prevent his skin from breaking. It took over a dozen staff members to move him. The hospital dietitian placed him on a strict regimen, mostly liquids, barely 100-200 calories a day. His body, trapped in this endless loop of retention and exhaustion, needed help remembering what balance felt like. But more than his body, it was his spirit that needed healing. The headlines outside screamed about him: world's heaviest man, human mountain, medical marvel. Every newspaper wanted a photograph. Every reporter wanted a quote. But John refused interviews. "I don't want to be a record," he told the doctor. "I just want to be a person again." Enter Dr. Robert Schwartz, a young physician with a calm voice and a curious mind. Unlike others, Schwartz didn't see a phenomenon, he saw a man who still laughed, who still loved, who still tried. He spent hours with John, not just taking vitals, but listening. They talked about old music, about the sea John missed so much, about the days he could walk down the pier with Jeanette's hand in his. "You've got a remarkable attitude," the doctor said once, adjusting John's oxygen mask. John smiled faintly. "When your body's heavy, your soul has to stay light, or you'll drown in yourself." It was a strange friendship, a doctor trying to save a life, and a patient teaching him what living truly meant. Weeks turned into months. The hospital became a strange kind of home. Nurses began calling him Mr. Sunshine, because even on his worst days, he'd find a way to make them smile. When they were tired or frustrated, he'd tell jokes about his size, not out of self-hate, but out of grace. "You see this?" he once said, patting his arm with a weak grin. "I'm technically my own furniture. Who else can say that?" Laughter filled the sterile air, and for a brief moment, everyone forgot about gravity. But beneath that humor was a man fighting a war no one could see. John's body began to respond to treatment. The liquid diet, combined with careful medical management, started reducing the fluid retention that had swollen his body for years. Slowly, almost miraculously, the numbers began to drop. 200 pounds, 300, 500. The weight fell like sand through open fingers. By 1979, doctors confirmed he had lost 924 pounds, one of the most extraordinary weight losses in recorded history. When Dr. Schwartz told him the number, John chuckled weakly. "Guess I finally found my diet secret," he joked. Intensive hospitalization. But privately, when Jeanette leaned down to kiss his forehead, tears filled his eyes. "I didn't think I'd ever feel light again," he whispered. After 19 months in the hospital, John was released. The staff nurses, orderlies, doctors lined the hallway as he was wheeled out. Some clapped softly. Others simply waved goodbye, too emotional to speak. He had gone from the brink of death to a fragile form of life again. Outside, the Seattle air was cool and damp. Rain sprinkled his face as they lifted him carefully into a reinforced van. He closed his eyes, inhaling the fresh air deeply, his first breath beyond hospital walls in over a year. Jeanette sat beside him, her hand resting on his. "You did it, John," she said softly. He looked at her, eyes glistening. "We did it." Back home, the house had been modified, larger doors, stronger floors, medical equipment neatly placed in corners. It wasn't the life he dreamed of, but it was a chance to live. For a while, it felt like a new beginning. The 1980s arrived gently. John's life became a pattern of small victories, sitting up longer each day, walking a few steps with help, enjoying breakfast with Jeanette by the window. They would watch the morning fog roll in over the water, the horizon blending into soft gray. Sometimes they wouldn't speak at all, just sit, hand in hand, listening to the world breathe. He loved those mornings. He loved her. Every letter they received from people around the world, from Germany, Japan, Brazil, carried the same message: "Your story gives us hope." And John, in turn, felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. "If people can find strength in my weakness," he told Jeanette one day, "then maybe it all meant something." He began keeping a journal, short entries written slowly in large, shaky letters. He wrote about the smell of coffee, the sound of laughter, the way Jeanette's eyes crinkled when she smiled. "These are the small things," he wrote, "the light things, the things that keep me from sinking." But life, even when gentle, never stops testing. By 1982, John's health began to decline again. Despite strict diets and medical supervision, his body, ravaged by years of strain, started retaining fluid once more. His heart struggled. His breathing grew shallow. The weight crept back, slow but merciless. When the doctors recommended another hospital stay, he looked at Jeanette and sighed. "I thought I was done being the headline." "You're not a headline," she said firmly. "You're my husband." Back at the hospital, everything felt both familiar and unbearably heavy. The machines, the antiseptic smell, the same fluorescent lights that seemed to hum louder when the nights got quiet. But this time something was different. John wasn't afraid. He had seen what love could do, how it could break down walls stronger than any weight. He had been carried not by strength, but by devotion. In the stillness of those hospital nights, John and Jeanette talked for hours about their first date, about the fair, about the dreams they still hadn't lived. "I wish I could dance with you," he said once. "You do," she replied, "every time you smile." They spoke of ordinary things: their garden, the neighbor's new dog, the sound of rain on the roof. It was their way of pretending that time was kind, that life wasn't slipping quietly out of reach. But they both knew. One night he turned to her and said softly, "If I don't make it through this, promise me you'll remember me the way I laughed, not the way I looked." Her hand trembled as she touched his cheek. "I could never forget your laughter, John. It's the sound that built our life." It was September 10th, 1983. The morning light spilled through the window, pale and soft. The machines beeped steadily beside him. His breathing had grown faint, shallow, rhythmic, the rhythm of someone nearing the end of a long road. Jeanette sat by his bed, holding his hand. Her eyes were swollen from nights without sleep. John stirred slightly, forcing a smile. "Hey," he whispered, "you still here? Always. You should get some rest." "I will, later." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes glistening. "Don't be sad for me," he said. "I've had more love than most people ever will." Then, with a small breath, almost like a sigh, he added, "That's enough for me." His fingers loosened around hers, the monitor flatlined, and just like that, the world grew a little quieter. There were no crowds. No cameras, no headlines this time, just a handful of people in a small cemetery overlooking the sea. The sky hung gray and low, the way John liked it. The rain came softly, as if the heavens themselves were mourning him. Dr. Schwartz stood beside Jeanette, his voice breaking as he spoke. "He taught us that the size of a man isn't measured in pounds, but in the weight of his kindness." Jeanette placed a single white rose on his coffin. She whispered something only he could hear, "You're light now, my love." And with that, the earth took him gently, like it was finally time to rest. In the years that followed, John's story continued to echo quietly around the world. People remembered the record, yes, the man who weighed 400 pounds. But for those who truly listened, it was never about that number. It was about a heart that refused to harden under the weight of pain. Jeanette kept his journals, every shaky letter, every thought about life's small beauties. Sometimes she'd read them aloud in her garden. The neighbors didn't know who she was speaking to, but she did. "The light things," she'd whisper, "the things that keep me from sinking." John's story reached people struggling with their own invisible weights: addiction, grief, loneliness, guilt. Many wrote to Jeanette, saying his words had saved them, that his courage had made them believe in second chances, and perhaps that was the point. John had carried more than flesh. He had carried humanity's heaviest truth, that sometimes our greatest battles are the ones no one can see. Decades later, medical textbooks would still mention his name. Scientists would study his condition, his metabolism, his biology, but none of them could quantify the man he was. They couldn't measure the way he lit up a room despite the pain. They couldn't measure the warmth in his humor or the gentleness in his eyes. They couldn't measure love. Jeanette, now older, once said in an interview, "He was never the world's heaviest man to me. He was the world's kindest." John's story is not a story about obesity. It's not about records or numbers or freakish headlines. It's about weight, the kind every soul carries in silence. Some people carry grief. Some carry guilt. Some carry a body they don't recognize. But John taught us that love, patient, unconditional love, can bear the heaviest loads. He once wrote near the end of his journal, "If you ever feel crushed by life, remember even mountains are just piles of broken stones held together by time and faith." Those were his last written words. In the end, John Brower Minock's story isn't about how much a man can weigh, it's about how much love can carry. The world measured his body in pounds, but those who knew him measured him in kindness, laughter, and grace. And that, perhaps, is the truest kind of weight there is. He never reached the ocean, but his story still travels farther than any tide. The world remembers John as the heaviest man who ever lived, but those who knew him remember the light in his eyes, not the number on the scale. His story is more than tragedy. It's a mirror, a reminder that every one of us carries a kind Weight, grief, shame, guilt, or loneliness that no one else can see. John's life teaches us that the heaviest burdens are not always made of flesh, but of feelings, and love, pure, patient love, is the only thing light enough to lift them. The world measured his body, but only love ever measured his soul.